Hello everybody, in today's video I'm going to be gutting this American 1100 lock. I'm going to go over what tools you're going to need and how to go about gutting and reassembling one of these. If you have one of your own and you're not familiar with gutting it, grab your lock and just go through it with me, and this will help you guys to get a little bit more familiar with gutting this lock. Let's get started. For gutting this lock, you're going to need a couple pair of tweezers, some type of screwdriver, pinning tray, a shim of course. You're going to need a plug follower and a core holder. Now the core holder isn't a necessity, but I like to have one just in case. And also you may need some type of gut wrench. I got this one from Sparrows, and as always there will be a link to everything that I'm mentioning in this video. I will leave it in the description. If it is not the exact link for these exact products, it will be something very comparable. So in order to gut this lock, I don't have a key for this one, so we're going to have to pick it. So I'm going to be using a top of keyway. I think this is a 40 thousandths, and I'm going to use the longer end of the tension wrench here. I'm not going to use the shorter end because of the lip on the front gets in the way if you try to use a shorter one. So even though the longer one is kind of too long, the shorter one is too short. So you're pretty much stuck with the longer one. I wish they would make one that, you know, fit these types of locks perfectly, but I haven't found one yet. All right, there we go. Now, remembering that this actually was picked to get it open, you've got to be careful when you're gutting it because you don't want to accidentally close the core and have to repick the lock. Now, I mean, you can do that, but it is just quite annoying. Right down in here, there's a little screw, so I'm going to be using my baby screwdriver here. We're just going to go ahead and remove that screw. Now, some of these can have quite a bit of Loctite on them, so they can get stuck in here quite easily. When that happens, I just like to take a little hammer, and you're basically just going to tap on the top of the screw, and that kind of loosens up this Loctite. But you're just going to take these three parts and set them aside. There is sometimes a little wafer down in here, and that actually blocks you from being able to bypass the lock with the bypass tool. If there is a wafer in here, I don't see one in this one, so it must have been an older model. I believe all the newer models of the 1100s have that wafer, so you wouldn't be able to bypass it with a bypass. Alright, now we've got to remember that we have to keep the core turned open, and to get that clamp off we've got our gut wrench. But in order to keep the core turned, I like to usually place my tensioner right in here and kind of hold it to the side while I'm trying to remove that clamp. Now, be careful when you're turning the core because there are holes in the bottom of the lock body here, you can see. And if you turn your core the entire way around, all the pins will fall out. So you just have to be very, very careful when dealing with these cores that you do not turn them the entire way. You don't want to have that happen. So it is kind of tedious if you don't have the key to gut one of these, because you do have to be careful that you don't turn that core any extra, and getting these clamps off can be quite a mess. I'm going to go ahead and shim this just because there's a little ledge back here. It can be a little bit of a mess if you are not careful. So I'm just going to go ahead and place a shim in the back just to make sure that if I should happen to mess anything up, these pins don't go scattering all over. Once you get this shim the entire way in, you can bump the front and push the front of your core right on out of there, and you don't want to do that. So make sure you're holding on to the front as you push the shim through. Make sure your shim is underneath the driver pins, and just remember that you've got to allow for that little gap, and you're going to place your follower right where that gap is, and that is where you're going to push it through. Now also you want to make sure where your key pins are going to come out, and we're going to just angle it so that our key pins don't fall out the bottom. And there you have it. So set that part aside, and we're going to go ahead and dump out the key pins. And remembering, key pins go from left for the first pin all the way to the right for the last pin. So left to right on your tray. The American 1100s don't have any type of milling or anything, so we can just set that aside. And now, of course, since your shim is in the back still, you want to pull that shim out so you have access to those pins. And you want to always mark the front. And I know that the front does look different on the 1100s. You can clearly see that there is a little kind of section here where the face of this lock will rest against. the front, so you can definitely tell, but I just make it a habit to always mark anyways, because you can be in a rush and wanting to put it back together and kind of rush through this process, and as long as you have that mark on the front, you won't miss it. You can see that if you turn this a certain way, now when you go to push it through, your pins are going to pop up and hit into that. So you want to just make sure that that is flipped in the correct direction. That way you're not pushing any of the pins out and it's not getting stuck under that little kind of ledge. And we're just going to go one at a time and just gently letting them up. Although these springs in here are very they're not very strong, so the pins are not wanting to come out, so I'm just going to gently tap them out. And now normally you wouldn't want to do that because you want to make sure you know the direction your pins are facing, but this is just an 1100 and there's not going to be anything fancy in here facing any, you know, it's not like there's a gin spool or something in there that's going to be needing to face in a certain direction. So if you have to tap them out of there, then you have to tap them out. It's not going to hurt anything. And it looks like that's what we're going to have to do with all these pins. And now I'm going to go ahead and flip the core around and come in through the back and get the rest of these out. Alright, and now there's nothing left in here. And we definitely have our front marked, so we can just set this aside. And I will give you a close-up of what the pins look like in there. And it's looking like we've just got mostly serrated with one spool pin in the middle. I find that the spool pins and serrated pins in these locks kind of vary. I've seen ones that have no spool pins at all, and I've seen ones that have a lot of spool pins. I think it just completely varies from lock to lock, so I don't think, you know, it's anything that can be predicted. It's either going to be spools or serrated. Now, I went over this in my video about how to gut a kick cylinder, and I'm just going to go through it one time with you on this American lock because I'd like to show you exactly how much of the pins in an American lock are actually, you know, being picked when you're picking these locks. I'm going to go ahead and put all the key pins back where they belong. If you take a look at the key pins, how close they are to the shear line already, you can see that not much of any of these pins is being picked. It's looking like just the tiniest clicks on 1, 2, 4, and 5, and there's a little bit on pin number 3, which is our spool pin. It looks to me like even on the spool pin, it's not even deep enough to hit that false set. Only the very bottom part of that spool reaches the shear line. So every pin inside of this lock is just going to be a standard pin with some serrations on them. And you might hit a couple of the serrations, but these pins are also already so close to the shear line that there's really not much to it that you would even be picking. Let's take a look at just any of them. So if it was in this 5th one, I can't even set it there. That key pin is just so high. It won't even barely set in the spot, and only a tiny part of that would get picked. And then moving to, you know, the next one, same thing. The only one that really has any type of depth is going to be that 3rd one. The other ones, I don't even think it hits that first serration, to be honest. So you just have to be careful on these locks because they can be very tricky when it comes to the pin interactions and what's actually going on inside the lock while you're picking it. For putting this back together, I'm just going to go ahead back through and do everything that I did and just do it in reverse. Remember that there are 6 holes in this core, but there's only 5 pins. If you are going to progressively pin one of these locks, just make sure that if you do put in any of the pins, you are making sure to put them in the correct positions and that you match it with a key pin to however many driver pins you put in. You can accidentally put, you know, driver pins 1 and 2 in and then key pins 4 and 5, and then you put your lock back together and you brick it. So just make sure that you're putting them all in the correct place and that you have enough drivers and key pins and that they're in the exact correct chambers. And don't gut a lock when you're tired, because if you do that, you can make tons of mistakes that you wouldn't normally make. Now we've got that all together. We're going to go ahead and put the shim back in. And remember, when you're shimming it to put it back together, the shim goes into the front and not the back this time. And you want it to stick out just a little bit over top of that spot there. And then we're going to go ahead and put this back. Now also remembering where your key pins are so you don't dump them. You want to just kind of slide it back through. Your shim is going to catch on the front of the lock right there, and just make sure that it's pushed through. Then you can pull your shim out and make sure that you're turning it in the correct direction, because you don't want, again, those key pins to fall down through those holes, and lock it back up. Right, and once you're all locked back up, you're going to go ahead and replace your clamp right away. Place the clamp onto the back of the lock again. Alright, and since I don't have a key to test this, I'm not able to test it, but I'm going to tell you what you have to do before putting the screw back into your lock. So you're going to go ahead and put your lock back in. You would close the shackle, and then you would place your key in there and test the lock. If the key opens this lock, then you are safe to go ahead and finish putting it back together and putting the screws in and finishing up. If you do not test it and you put your screw in, you can find that you've made some type of mistake when you put the lock back together. You can actually get your lock stuck in the lock body. And how would I know this, you ask? Because I've done it. So always double check that you've got your lock pinned back up and back in place properly with the key before you put the screw back into the lock. And then once you've tested it and you know that it works, you can place your screw back in the lock and close it back up. And there you have it. That is how you would gut and reassemble the American 1100. Now, keep in mind that a lot of things can go wrong when you're gutting these locks. Don't freak out if it does go wrong. The huge part of Locksport is gutting your locks, so you've got to practice. And the more you practice, the easier it will become. And the more that you will kind of remember to do certain things, it will all become kind of second nature to you. So for now, you might have to follow along with a video, but soon enough, you'll be able to do it just fine on your own. It's going to take time to get the hang of these things. If you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment section. Or, you know, if you've had a rough time gutting one in the past or anything like that, I'd love to hear your stories. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like my channel, please subscribe. Also, I'm now offering channel memberships on my channel. If you'd like more information, there is a link in the description.